Okay, test. Test number 2. Today, Neon Genesis Evangelion.
In 2009, I had the bright idea to buy a cheap-ish HD camcorder, move around furniture in my mother's apartment, and sit in a poorly lit corner of the room to talk about anime, wearing a $10 lab coat from the local university's nursing school. I set up the camera, replaced some of the books on the shelf behind me with my meager DVD collection of the time, and began to speak at length about the first in a series of 4 films that would take another 12 years to complete. I did not know that then, nor did I really speculate on what the future would hold for the series. After all, at that exact moment in time, while the second film in the series had been released to Japanese theaters, it would be another 2 years until an English release was made. Hell, I didn't even own a copy of the first film, instead opting for a poorly printed cover on an empty DVD case to use as a prop. That video was never released. I never got past the editing phase with it, because very similar to the show's main character, I had very low self-esteem and constantly found flaws in what I had recorded compared to other contemporary video makers at the time. Eventually, after another test that involved talking about the D-Gray Man manga, I opted to record in an entirely different section of the apartment to combat what my inexperience perceived were issues I had with lighting, and I made a video discussing the first 3 episodes of Black Butler, which was recently airing at the time. Honestly, in retrospect, this video was filmed in even worse conditions than the original Evangelion test, but I learned so much through the experience. At the time, I had no idea what anime to start discussing, no real gauge on what people would be interested in hearing a 19-year-old anime fan from Newfoundland, Canada talk about. So I worked with a combination of what I knew, what I enjoyed, and looking back, I don't find it all that surprising that I started with Neon Genesis Evangelion. Since that time, all the way up to now, I haven't talked about Eva all that much. It has a level of reverence to it, not just to myself, but to the community as a whole, and because of that, I didn't just want to be another voice in a sea of people praising it or bashing it for the various legitimate reasons that people have done so over the years. I don't feel like Evangelion is a series that I can personally come back to, so in an attempt to make this video as complete as possible and avoid the very thing that Eva did by having the end of Evangelion happen not just once, but twice so far, we need to go back. Today, I don't just want to talk about Evangelion as an uber popular TV anime that spawned theatrical follow-ups and an entire completed reboot. I wanted to talk about Evangelion as a whole, and how it has affected me as a watcher and discusser of anime. So we are going to start at the very place where I think myself and many other anime fans of the mid-aughts first learned about Evangelion. In hell. AMV Hell 3, the motion picture, was and still is an interesting entry in our Western fan lexicon. As a 15-year-old anime fan in 2005, witnessing the existence of it was something of an eye-opening experience. This was the age where if you lived in the country, like I did, you had to handle the demon that was dial-up internet, and downloading entire shows to watch was a pipe dream, let alone what we know now as modern anime streaming. So AMV Hell, specifically AMV Hell 3, the motion picture, offered a unique bit of entertainment for me and my high school friends at the time. It's a massive collection of funny clips with anime footage that, while not indicative of any of the shows they were ripped from, still had us take away the undying question of what were these shows actually like? Plenty of my favorite anime of the era were featured in that self-titled theatrical film, and several others I would have never watched if not because of it. I doubt I was the only one who picked up a copy of Grenadier just to see what the show with 2 large-breasted gunslingers who reload their guns by bouncing their chests was all about. Spoilers! It's not worth it. Hell 3 was also my intro to Azumanga, Hellsing, and even Berserk from that perfect age where the 90s anime was all we had. Those were the days. But of course, AMV Hell 3 was also my introduction to Evangelion. At the time, I didn't really know what it was. There were cool, interesting characters and giant robots, and that was really all I cared about at the time. I had zero idea that I'd still be thinking about it on the regular this many years later. Sometimes I think back to like other anime that I first watched back then that didn't spawn into this massive behemoth of a franchise. Because like I was probably far more interested at the time in rewatching stuff like Slayers or Chobits, than rewatching Evangelion. But even still, it was a series that I kept going back to over the years. Hell, I've named all of my laptops after ASUKA, not just because most of them are branded by Republic of Gamers and it gave them this red styling on my case, or in the case of my university laptop, actual flames on the outer casing. It was a refurbished model and it beat the crap out of my desktop at the time, so of course I didn't care if it had flames. I'm sure my professors got a good chuckle out of it though, because I was in an art department, so our classes were just consisted of this sea of white MacBooks, and there in the back, just off to the side where the only plugs in the room was just me and my flaming red laptop. Good times. The battery life was the other main reason that I ended up naming my laptops after ASUKA, and also why I will continue to do so, since while all model Evangelions have external battery limits, ASUKA is the main pilot where that limit has been a plot point, both, in the show and the various films. So when I had to choose a name, as I tend to do with all of my electronics, that was what first came to me. And now, we are probably reaching the point of the video where you may be asking yourself, what is this? I clicked on a video about Evangelion, and you're going on a tangent about laptops and university. What in the hey? But yes, this is very important. For you see, this is how Neon Genesis Evangelion has infected my life. No other anime has affected my life in this way for this long. No other anime from my high school years, barring maybe Bebop, has consistently been a presence in my life. And even then, Bebop didn't have a slow drip of sequel content since like 2007. We're not talking about the other thing. Evangelion is a narrative that I continually found myself latching and reattaching myself to various parts of it throughout my life. So, when it was announced that the series with its half-baked finale and controversial re-ending film was getting yet another version, another attempt to showcase what the writers, Hideaki Anno specifically, wanted to express, I was obviously intrigued. I couldn't back down at this point. I was far too invested. Which brings us back to the initial clip of this video. I have been following the rebuild of Evangelion since its inception. I was in high school when it was announced. I built my channel as it was airing. I have witnessed countless anime come and go as we waited with bated breath for any news about when the next entry in the film series would be released. But now, it's over. I am making this video now, not just for me, but I'm also making it for every person during that span of time who asked me, when am I going to make a video about the rebuild of Evangelion? As it has been, by far, my most historically requested video. But I am also, of course, making this video, I think, for my past self. For that young man in Newfoundland who had no idea what making a video about anime would do to change his life over the next 12 years. So, ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Arcada, and today, on Glass Reflection, we are finally discussing the 4 films in the Rebuild of Evangelion series. Yet another end to Evangelion to see what the great Hideaki Anno has done after tearing his work down. Because as the films themselves say, breaking apart the world is a trivial matter. However, rebuilding it is not so easy. Let's jam. Rebuild of Evangelion 1.0. I think many people, especially at the start of this whole thing, viewed the beginning of this rebuild of Evangelion film series in a very similar light to other readaptations of anime done over the years. Sure, 1.0 predates Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, arguably the most famous readaptation of an anime, but the idea of readaptation has been cemented in our little subculture as something not only possible, but for when a series gets popular enough productions, almost expected. Rebuild of Evangelion 1.0, you are not alone carried with it very little in the way of changes. It was an almost shot-for-shot remake of a large chunk of the original series, from the opening sequence to the end of the original's episode 6. This was the foundation for what would follow, and I feel like the reason that 1.0 changed so little is because, as this was early Evangelion, most of it was probably done exactly how Anno wanted it to be done the first time round. The original production of Neon Genesis Evangelion was famously marred by a myriad of production issues throughout its development. Most of those issues involved funding, so it's quite possible that these first 6 episodes were the ones that Anno was the most content with when looking back and deciding how to move forward with his new vision. It's only after this point that the gloves come off and the edits start to hit a little bit harder. Watching 1.0, especially for an existing fan though, is not easy. In most cases, I feel like I would not be in the minority to say that if you've watched the original series, like I did, especially if you watched it again in the lead up to watching the rebuilds, something which, again, I recommend you do, is that 1.0 is mostly superfluous. There is, of course, that one added cameo scene at the end of the film, but personally, that only holds a lot of weight as something to be watched if the other films didn't exist yet. Something to tide people over for another 2 years until the next film, and it's less of a massively important scene to the overall film series. Not to mention that the final scene really only means anything to people who have watched the original series. People who know Kaoru Nagisa and what his importance actually is, which, as I mentioned before, if you've already watched the series, there's not much here for you in this film besides this. The film as a whole is better animated than the original, to be sure, and my god, it is good to listen to the rearranged score of the show with a decent budget. Yeah, Decisive Battle is still a ripoff of 007's From Russia with Love, but honestly, I think we are culturally at a point where if someone knows what Evangelion actually is, they'd probably prefer this version over the 007 original. I didn't make that up, these are just facts. Utada Hikaru also was brought on to perform original theme music, that's an addition as well, which is alright, I suppose. I have nothing against the song. Hikaru is amazing, no doubt, but 1.0 musically just reminded me that all of the rebuilds are missing the 2 most famous songs from the original Evangelion series. Fly Me to the Moon and Cruel Angel's Thesis. Oh yeah, I realize we're still only talking about 1.0 right now, but even all the way until the end of 4.0, the original theme of Evangelion, the series, is never used throughout any of the films. Fly Me to the Moon, while its absence is depressing, to be sure, there was at least a logical explanation for it. International copyright law is such that they would have to probably spend massive amounts of money to use that music, and they just decided to not. Fair enough, I suppose. But A Cruel Angel's Thesis? They own that song in its entirety, last I checked. Like, I expected a rearranged version of that to be used at, like, I don't know, the climax of 4.0 or something to tie the films up in a bow, or at least play over the credits, but nope. It's just gone. More reasons to keep watching the original series, I guess. One of the last remaining good points to 1.0 exists within the dub. The fact, however, that the next logical question to follow is, which dub? Makes me wonder if we're going to actually have to have a tangent, or if that would be better served to talk about later. Now, let's just talk about it now. Tangent! Dub time! The rebuild films, with the exception of the final film, have 2 separately recorded dubs, one being the Funimation release and the second one being done by Dubbing Brothers USA for the Amazon streaming release. Both dubs have the benefit of retaining key members of the cast from the original ADV recording of the 1995 TV series. However, the Funimation dub does have quite a few recasts, namely that of Rei Ayanami, and virtually any character outside of the core cast. The Amazon dub fixes that in some ways, but it lays out additional problems. Okay, so Amazon dub. On the one hand, the actors for Shinji, Misato, and Asuka from 2.0 forward stay and are reaccompanied by more or less the entire ADV dub cast. Personally, I don't have much of a problem with the cast themselves in either dub. Having started watching Eva with the ADV dub back in the day, hearing everyone return for this Amazon release was a great treat for me. It was a wonderful thing for Eva to come full circle, at least in some way, to provide English fans with a bit of closure. That said, however, these redubs were done fairly recently, and while I love them all, the cast aren't necessarily young anymore, so playing characters that are in some cases like 14 comes through on occasion. This is not at all helped by what I would charitably call a stilted translation. There has been a decent amount of discussion online regarding the retranslations of not only the original series that it got for its Netflix debut, but also for the rebuild films on the Amazon release. I feel like if I went too far into it, it would just be a list of complaints, which I don't necessarily feel like would be fair to those that worked on the translation itself and the dub as a whole. I will say that the benefit of the new translation is that they are indeed closer to the original text than other versions. ADV back in the day was, from what I have read, flying by the seat of their pants to get the OG Ava dub done. Episodes were translated as they came in, and in some places, not knowing where the show was headed led to some mistakes and liberties taken here or there with translation. They didn't really have any other choice in the matter. Then, with the Funimation dub on the rebuilds, well, Funimation has always been a company that likes to at least act as though they are dubbing anime by fans for fans. As such, they are more likely to make translation decisions that would better be understood by its North American audience in lieu of being textually accurate. Personally, I like to see a bit of both in the dubs I watch, where we don't swing too hard in one direction or another. I like being as close to the original as possible so as to not have the audience mistake intent by the creators, while at the same time not being so literal in translations that the meaning gets lost anyways, because either the audience doesn't have the correct vocabulary to match the translation, or how a translation can just, break our language entirely for the sake of accuracy. Of course, there are other glaring mistakes as well. Some people have caught other examples elsewhere, but when I was watching 4.0, there was this scene between Ritsuko and Misato where Ritsuko's lip flaps were moving, but Misato's voice was coming out. I don't know how they messed up which line belonged to what character, but it happened. In simple terms, and this is where I'll leave the dub conversation, I am overjoyed by the return of the original cast, but if this was supposed to be the definitive dub to fix all of the supposed rush jobs of the past, well, it could have used a little bit more time to be worthy of our grace. So I think I have covered what I want to say on Rebuild of Evangelion 1.0. You are not alone. It is a faithful visual upgrade from the original material, only marred by the fact that nothing from the rebuilds negates all reason to witness and experience the original series, unlike other anime readaptations that have come out over the years. Thus, making this film an easy skip, even with all of its fancy upgrades. Because, really, when we wanted a sequel, a good, proper change and continuation of the Evangelion story, it's the next film where that starts to shine through. Rebuild of Evangelion 2.0, You Can Not Advance, was released nearly 2 years following the original film and marks the first time since the release of End of Evangelion in 1999 that the franchise has seen any legitimate new additions to its considerable dogma. If, of course, you ignore the pre-credit sequence in 1.0, which I personally do. It was the entry in the film series I was most excited to witness for a number of reasons. Again, the new footage. Finally, some new footage after waiting years since the film series announcement and the release of 1.0. We got to see the return of Asuka, my personal favorite Ava pilot from the original series, and best of all, or what I assumed going into the film, is that we'd get to see the trio of pilots interact again during the time, canonically, where Ava was its most fun. There was a period of episodes during the show's original run, including Asuka's introduction and pushing it forward all the way until the final third of episodes, thereabouts, where Ava was, for lack of a better description, a well-produced Monster of the Week series. A new angel would appear and the characters would need to come up with a new way to defeat the threat that culminates in a quick battle scene before the angel explodes, usually in a symbolic cross-like fashion before the episode ends, and we do it all over again next week. Totally stole that from my old review. Probably no one noticed until I just said that. I'm moving on. Over time, though, the more heavy-handed material that Ava is known for slowly creeps in, and the mental health of our characters, Shinji especially, rapidly deteriorates until the show could not really be called fun in the same way. This is, of course, not to imply that the change in tone and themes was a bad thing, far from it, but it was still an enjoyable section of the narrative before things got far too serious, and to see that adapted in some way would have been amazing to me. Would have. I, of course, in my folly, did not originally consider that since the plan was to condense all of Evangelion's story into a mere 4 films, that much of this content, perhaps created to pad out the original episode length from the TV series would be cut entirely. And that includes the fun period of the original narrative that I enjoyed so much. Rebuild of Evangelion 2.0, You Cannot Advance, does not have any wacky Eva hijinks. Where that would normally take place is where the narrative starts to massively diverge from its original material. We do not get a decent onslaught of new angels, as this film in totality debuts 5 of them throughout the film, 4 that our usual main characters get to handle in a variety of ways, plus 1 bonus fight for the so far unmentioned Neko Megane Boing character. We'll get to her later. Of the 4 main Eva fights, 1 is easy cannon fodder used to segue Asuka's reintroduction, fair enough. Second being the 10th angel from the TV series rebranded into the 8th angel here, which has our trio of characters being forced to work together for what was, unbeknownst to us at the time, one of the few moments in this entire film series where these 3 characters would do just that in order to fight off a threat. The 3rd angel is where fans of the original series may have noticed sudden, massive changes, as the 9th angel from the rebuilds is basically this kind of blue ooze that is able to infect and co-opt Evangelion Unit 3 into doing its bidding. This occurs in the original series, actually. However, the main glaring difference is that in this case, Asuka was designated as pilot for that Eva unit when it went rogue, unlike the secondary character of Toji, who in the rebuilds never becomes an Eva pilot in the first place. That was a thing. It's here that I started to build a hypothesis of mine that either perhaps simply this film series was never meant to be watched without the original as an accompaniment in order to, fill in the gaps of characterization the films did not have time for. Or perhaps the rebuilds aren't actually a reinterpretation, but a potential sequel hundreds of years later, forcing events into a constant loop of death and rebirth. The latter of those theories actually falls apart in several places, especially after 4.0. But at this time when this film came out originally, it was something that and I think a lot of us toyed with as a possible explanation, not just for the slight changes in story, but the more massive ones as well. At the very least, though, I can say that to a certain extent, I believe production on the rebuilds had a certain level of assumptions being made about the audience's knowledge of the material. Sure, they probably never wrote anything explicitly to ignore or sideline newer fans who had only the rebuilds to work off of, but the added context given by the original series, even if most of that knowledge becomes canonically irrelevant, is still in some way helpful for our attachment to these characters. So back to the fight against Unit 3 for a moment, though. Here, Shinji is stuck in a situation where he has to witness from his cockpit his own Evangelion unit controlled by Nerve headquarters to kill, or at least seem to kill, Asuka, his new friend. That's the result of this fight. Her Eva got taken over, he refused to fight her, his dad had Shinji locked out, and they controlled his Eva remotely. Asuka possibly dies. For the watchers of the original series, this is a heavy scene, because we know Shinji and Asuka and their relationship. We can feel similar to Shinji in this scene because we know these characters. But in the context of the rebuilds, Asuka only just appeared, and her interactions with Shinji haven't really been all that positive. All soon and less dere as far as Shinji was concerned, so his attachment to her seems a little off in that context. The final climax of this film has him piloting an Eva to save Rei, the one character he has had many positive associations with in this film series. So that still makes sense, but the fight against Asuka, or rather the angel that took her over, was a bit more shaky. The time and character investment just isn't there. Without the original series in the characterization that it gave to fall back on, I feel that it's a bit of a stretch to say that Shinji would care that much about this girl he just met. He might not want to kill her on moral grounds, sure, because I doubt anyone wants to kill, well, anyone, but he seemed so affected by the fact that it's Asuka, who he calls a friend. When really, I don't believe that this Asuka is the one that Shinji was ever friends with. So let's talk about that for a moment. Tangent! Asuka, Shikinami, Langley. So the addition of just more Eva was a big plus for this film, to be sure. But as I mentioned, I was also super excited for the return of Asuka Langley Soyu to the franchise. Puzzlingly, however, her character was inexplicably at the time renamed. Instead of the familiar Asuka Langley Soyu, she is instead introduced as Asuka Shikinami Langley. The reasoning behind this change was not revealed until much later in the film franchise, but suffice it to say that even in 2.0 it slowly came into focus that Asuka from the rebuilds was an ever so slightly different animal than her original incarnation from Neon Genesis Evangelion. Originally, when I witnessed her change, I was overjoyed. Like, seeing a favorite character of yours beautifully reanimated with modern tech is such a delight to see. Her interactions with much of the cast remained from what I remembered, but it took quite a while for the changes to really become realized for me. Part of this probably ties into the fact that this, as a film, there's just a limited running time to tell your story compared to a longer 20+ episode television series and accompanying sequel film. Like those fun storylines that I mentioned previously from the series that gave us such good characterizations of her character no longer existed. There is no sequence in the rebuild that has Asuka dive into a volcano. No part where her and Shinji need to synchronize via hardcore dance revolution to defeat an angel. And most glaringly, her infatuation and relationship with secondary character Kaiji is completely removed. That last bit really should have been a thing I picked up on far sooner than I actually did. In Neon Genesis Evangelion, Asuka Soyuz spent so much time pining over Kaiji, forcing him into this awkward love triangle between her and Misato, his former lover. It's an interesting, if one-sided relationship because Asuka, not even being 15 years old, was far too young for the much older Kaiji. He never seemed interested in her, even a little, instead just putting up with her antics. But their relationship was such a big part of her character. Because I think that she knew from the start that he didn't care, but she acted the way that she did regardless. It was such a fascinating part of her character. This lie is so deep, but told with such certainty to make it almost real. And none of that makes it over to the rebuilds. Asuka Shikinami holds no romantic feelings towards anyone, really, though later she claims to have a minor infatuation with Shinji. It is hard to tell with her personality, to be fair. I still just don't buy it. Shikinami, in fact, doesn't have much of a relationship with any of the characters. She knows of Misato, perhaps I think meeting once briefly, but beyond that she's mostly alone. She didn't know Rei, didn't know Shinji or his friends from school. Heck, we don't even bother focusing on the fact that she joined the school. She's there, of course. There are at least 2 scenes in the classroom where she's present, but it really just moves into this assumption of, well, of course she's there, but not really explaining it or developing it as anything important. Shikinami Asuka is almost just a fragment of the character Asuka used to be in this film. I didn't know it at the time when I first watched the film, but the aspects of her design and personality, the things that made her have a purpose and made her important to the narrative overall were just slowly being sucked away. Not entirely, just enough to make a hole in the narrative large enough for something else to parachute in. So in the first 2 films, there are still plenty of things that remain from the original, things that distinctly make Evangelion, and not even Anno felt the need or desire to change them, largely. Perhaps it's for that reason that he felt the need to make a more defined, clean break for the remainder of the narrative. A time skip, perhaps. 3.0. The time skip! Rebuild of Evangelion 3.0, you can not redo. Released 3 years after Rebuild of Evangelion 2.0, you cannot advance. Slowly increasing the gap between releases until it becomes, frankly, ridiculous. The apparent goal of Rebuild of Evangelion 3.0, you cannot redo, is to reintroduce the status quo, or at least settle into what will be the new normal moving forward into the final film. We have now entirely departed from the original series, and very few similarities remain. What does still exist is more nebulous and not entirely confirmed. 3.0 shows us the fallout of the final scene from the previous film, and briefly explains what has occurred in the intervening years. It reintroduces the character of Karu Nagisa and shows us his new relationship with Shinji. They show off a bunch of new tech, a new Rei in a black plug suit, and a whole new world where many characters look the same, but not all remains intact. We can't get very far in discussing Rebuild of Evangelion 3.0, you cannot redo, without first discussing the time skip. Time skips usually fulfill the purpose of changing things up, allowing for time to pass, for things to just settle narratively before introducing new threats or problems to the characters that they then have to come back together and solve. The problem I have with time skips, though, is how very little they actually should affect the narrative. Here in 3.0, the time skip is 14 years. However, throughout the entirety of this one film, with I think one exception, the time skip could have been 6 months, or only 1 full year, and not much would have felt out of place. Having Toji's younger sister here, 14 years older, is about the only exception, to the point where her existence is the main thing that other characters point to in order to show Shinji how much has changed. But most of the old NERV support staff is still there, and they look more weathered, but I could believe that it's only been a year. Misato and Ritsuko have new outfits and hairstyles, but nothing so drastic to indicate that it's been 15 years. Then, when it comes to Asuka and Mari, hell, they go out of their way to explain that being an EVA pilot stops those specific characters from physically aging. It's like they introduced the time skip in order to separate this new narrative from old canon, but then do their best to ignore it for the sake of keeping most of the characters here and relevant to the plot. It's almost like this was just an excuse to say, hey, the characters are at least 30 years old now, so it's not wrong to be looking at these characters who are totally not 14 years old anymore. That can't be the reason, right? So it's been 15 years. These characters have broken off from NERV and have started their own rebel organization. But wait! None of the identifiable characters died during that time? No losses? Well, there was that one loss, but that happened at the end of 2.0, apparently, and we don't even get told about it until the next film, so that doesn't count. This is why time skips bother me. It's such a useful and interesting narrative mechanic when used well, but far more often is just to help hand-wave things away. That's a lot of what I feel Rebuild of Evangelion 3.0 You Cannot Redo is, just a massive hand-wave. Like, what's the biggest thing that happens in this film's narrative, right? Shinji is racked with internal conflict, not knowing who to trust, and is still manipulated by those around him for their own goals, namely his father, who doesn't even need to talk to his son to slowly break him mentally into thinking that he has no choice or agency in his life, only for Kaoru to step in and give him a reason to keep fighting. This isn't all too dissimilar to what happens to Shinji throughout the original. Like, the methods are different, but the ends are functionally the same. Shinji ends up doing exactly what his father wants, to the detriment of all of the other characters, and he doesn't even realize it. He is so broken through trauma and experience that by the end, even his lifeline Kaoru cannot convince him to not do the thing his father wants. How does the time skip affect this development with Shinji? Well, when he arrives, everyone thought he was dead. Some probably feel like he is some weird recreation and not actually the boy that they knew. They don't trust Shinji, and yet still expect him to listen to what they say when he has no reason to believe them. They don't talk to him, and that lack of communication starts to send him spiraling. But I really think that setup could have still happened 15-year time skip or not. The whole narrative of this film hinges on these characters not communicating with one another. If they just sat Shinji down at the start, and it didn't even have to be Misato or Asuka if they couldn't keep their cool, have it be Ritsuko, have it be Maya. Heck, this would have been perfect to use Mari and have her swoop in and start developing an actual relationship with Shinji. But of course, none of that happens, because if it did, then there's little chance that Shinji would have been mentally broken enough to do what he needs to do at the end of this film for the plot to continue. It's part of this film and this franchise's biggest issue. It just requires communication to be at an all-time low. Like, I suppose that in some ways of looking at it, it's fine, because it's not like most relationships between people have perfect communication, and there are reasonable explanations for why the rebel NERV crew in Waylay have little reason to trust Shinji. And by leaving Shinji in the dark and then having Kaoru step in, Ano is really just trying to make us relate more to Shinji, because we are just as in the dark as he is. But because of this, there's the inevitable frustration, because the lack of communication is written in such a way that just makes these otherwise intelligent characters seem super dumb And it bothers me. Let's take Misato for a quick example. She, at the end of 2.0, is just standing there at what might have been the end of the world, cheering Shinji on. She knows what he is doing, or at least what he is trying to do, save Rei, and she is 100% on board with it. So he does. He ends up getting locked in some kind of stasis for years until they can retrieve him, and then, all of a sudden, all of the problems in the world are his fault. Misato's once encouraging and cheering attitude towards Shinji goes ice cold, and it's not hard to see why Shinji might feel a little bit of whiplash here. He gets that from virtually every character. They're all like that, because here in 3.0, I don't think any of them matter. It really feels like after 2.0, Anno decided for one reason or another to step back, to pull away from the large character-focused narrative that the second film was, and just focus more on just Shinji. He's really the only character that gets any development here. Misato? We don't know her inner turmoil over the time skip till 4.0. Ritsuko? I don't think we ever learn enough about this version of her. The rest of the Waylay staff? Again, they don't matter and don't have their own real characters until 4.0. 3.0 is just Shinji, Kaoru, Shinji. I'd be fine with this change. I would be fine with how this worked out if it was just done in a way that didn't make me feel like these characters acted this particular way only because the plot demanded it. If their actions, if their massive passive-aggressive attitudes towards Shinji were a bit more fleshed out, I'd probably be a lot less annoyed about it. That said, how this was used, how this eventually morphed to the benefit of the relationship between Shinji and Kaoru, I'm conflicted. Again, I don't like how the majority of the cast started to act like they just shut off their brains for a day. But what this did do in the end is give us far more time and development for the relationship between this film's two lead male characters. I'd argue that their relationship in this film far exceeded the quality that they had in the original. This was a good thing, because in the original TV series, it took some time to really understand what Kaoru's deal was. And while I think that it's still the case to some extent, he seems to develop a genuine attachment to Shinji here in such a better way than previously. The two characters have a history of subtext between them that shipping fans have adored since the start, despite Kara and Anno's apparent dislike for that interpretation of their relationship. But even just taking that out of the equation, they develop a genuine connection throughout this film. Like, Shinji is such a broken shell that it doesn't take much for Kaoru to just step in and make him feel like that he has purpose again. All Shinji needed was someone to just be a freaking decent human being for once. Hilarious considering Kaoru isn't one, but that's all it took. And what was that relationship, that wonderful connection used for? Let's do the third impact again. Okay, I didn't mention this while talking about 2.0 because I feel like here is a much better place for it. In the original canon of the show, the third impact, the end of the world, occurred during the film End of Evangelion. It is a major moment that basically ended the entire narrative on not the best of notes. So important, in fact, that Anno felt to tease us with this massive event in the story, not once, but twice. Oh shit, things are going wrong at the end of 2.0. It's the third impact. Already? Sure, why not? But oh wait, come 3.0, that wasn't the real third impact, just most of it. The world is screwed, but really what we need to do is stop the impact from actually occurring. Unless you are Shinji, who gets convinced that ending the world to make a better one is good, actually. So let's try this third impact thing again. But wait, there's still this whole other film to go through. I mean, it just feels like they keep teasing the end of Eva as this major plot point every time, and it continually feels forced as to why it never happened properly when they first attempted it. Rebuild of Evangelion 3.0, you cannot redo, initially gave us the expectations that things would slowly come into focus, that the reasonings for this entire film franchise would start to come to light. But I think for most of it, it just left us with more questions than answers. Sure, that's kind of Evangelion in a nutshell. People are still arguing over interpretations of the original series to this day, and probably will continue for another decade, if not longer. But I don't think that any of us expected to have to wait 8 years for the next film. 4.0. The end of Evangelion again. Evangelion 3.0 plus 1.0 thrice upon a time makes something about the Rebuild series clear, especially if the changes introduced in 2.0 and 3.0 did not. Rebuild of Evangelion is not a traditional narrative tale. I'd argue, especially after also watching the documentary that was released accompanying 4.0, that the rebuilds are barely a cohesive narrative. That's not what I think they're supposed to be. The rebuilds are not supposed to show us a thrilling or deep story in any traditional sense. What we ended up with is more like the inevitable result rather than the intended outcome. In reality, I view the entirety of Rebuild as not its own narrative, but rather the end result of an over 15-year therapy session for Hideaki Anno. It's not really a secret, even with the original series, that Hideaki Anno has a habit of basing characters in his works, Evangelion especially, after different aspects of himself. As such, it's not that hard to then surmise that any particular character arc that he focuses on is just him dealing with and learning to better understand those parts of himself. In that way, I think the changes made to Asuka's character from the original into the rebuilds starts to make a lot more sense. She is not simply a broken girl pining for love from someone who won't even look at her the way that she wants. In fact, she now shares many backstory aspects with Rei Ayanami. She is not a singular child who suffered trauma at a young age. She's a clone whose original... Well, actually, the clone aspect of Asuka was never fully explained. Perhaps it's a loose tie-in with, I don't know, the original continuity of the series, and End of Evangelion was her original, was the Asuka Soyu we came to know, or perhaps it's something else entirely. But the point is that her role has changed. Before, Asuka's role was that of a girlfriend for Shinji, somewhat, even if they never got together unless you count whatever the hell happened at End of Evangelion. She was a romantic companion of a sort with her own damage to counter Shinji's, because at the time, perhaps, that was a void in his life that Anno wanted filled somehow. But a funny thing happened between the releases of End of Evangelion and Rebuild of Evangelion 1.0, You Are Not Alone. Hideaki Anno got married. He now suddenly in his life had something far more than a girlfriend. But how would this change in his personal relationships manifest in Evangelion? Asuka was the fireball redhead that you wanted to date. Misato was the mature older woman to have as a lover. Rei was the stacked doll to cuddle up with when you feel emotionally vulnerable. But what if we could combine those fan service elements and add Megane? Tangent! Please welcome to the franchise, Mari, a Makanami illustrious, or as I like to refer to her, Neko Megane Boing Boing. The character who the writers forgot they newly introduced, so they had to force her to have a purpose in the final climax of her introduction that narratively could have been handled by anyone else. In a more metaphorical sense, Mari's existence, while seemingly superfluous to the plot of Rebuild of Evangelion 2.0, You Cannot Advance, and fulfilling a role easily removed or altered into non-existence by virtue of not being there originally, she rounds out the female pilot cast by being to Shinji the final form of female companionship that he never had previously. If in the original series, Rei represented a mother figure, with Rei being some kind of weird reincarnation clone of Shinji's actual mom, and if Asuka was set up to be more as a lover/girlfriend, minus any actual romantic attraction as indicated by some scenes, then it is quite clear where Mari fits in here, a role that needs filling with the advent of an older Shinji, an older audience who has grown up with the franchise, and an older Hideaki Anno who shepherds the whole thing. Mari is the wife. I remember reading that her glasses were a decision by the film's character designer in order to visually separate her from the other female members of the cast. This is probably also why Ritsuko lost her glasses post 2.0. But it's not lost on me that when you look up footage of mangaka Miyoko Anno, who Hideaki Anno married in 2002, you can see that she also likes wearing glasses of the same style. Coincidence? I think not. This ties back to the idea that Rebuild of Evangelion is less of a narrative experience and more of just Anno contextualizing so many different parts of his life and relationships into his work. Mari isn't added into the mix to just fill the gaps in the franchise's fan service offerings and sell additional figures. She gets added in because Anno of the 90s never had a wife. never had that kind of companionship to incorporate in the first place. Perhaps he didn't feel like it was necessary at the time, instead letting Misato shoulder most of his ideas for a mature, older woman. But at the same time, though, I would have thought that if Mari was supposed to fill some kind of wife role, that she would have been better written for it. Narratively, her inclusion in the story makes little sense. Her interactions with Shinji are few and far between, with a brief meeting in 2.0 that amounts to little more than fan service wrapped up in a needless character introduction, only for the two to then never meet again until the advent of the final battle in 4.0. Then, scenes later, having Mari blindly and forcefully declare that she will save Shinji no matter what. They don't know each other. Shinji doesn't even know her name until the end of the final film, and yet, in these final moments of this franchise, of this film series, you have the two of them together? Why? Because the narrative doesn't matter. I think. Perhaps it doesn't matter that my preconceptions of the character are just extremely hard to shake off. I've had it ingrained in my head ever since I first watched Rebuild of Evangelion 2.0. You cannot advance that Mari is a near worthless addition to the film series, filling a role that narratively could have easily been handled by any other existing character. Hell, her use of Unit 2 in that film felt more like the writing team just realizing they haven't given her character all that much to do in the film's climax, all that much purpose, so she needed something in the final act to justify her existence. But it takes a while to showcase what her existence is actually for. She's here to destroy Evangelion. Her introductory scene at the start of the second film was indeed great, because not only was it the first, real new story that the Evangelion franchise has had in over 12 years, but it featured other aspects of the Nerve organization, an Eva modded into a tank, and this new character, this spunky, fearless pilot who goes from introduction to kamikaze Eva strikes in a matter of minutes. But how any of this ties to the overall plot of the film series is anyone's guess. That, I believe, is the point. Mari is lulling the audience into a false sense of security, making us think that, oh, now we are finally getting new additions to the franchise that we wanted. But then, nothing. She blows up an Eva in the intro, but her actions beyond that point, again, could have all been served by another character. Her being functionally useless is part of her purpose. We thought we were going to get another badass female Eva pilot, someone who might, knock some sense into Shinji, make him overcome his damage so that we could stop making fun of his character and telling him to get in the goddamn robot. But she does none of that. She's an intriguing character, to be sure. She acts quite unlike any of the pilots that we have seen before, but all of this is just a misdirection. A misunderstanding of her purpose. Unlike virtually every other Eva pilot in this series, Mari, at least on the outside, never showcases her damage. She is a stark change from what we have come to expect from an Eva pilot. She's not an emotionless robot or a person damaged beyond repair. She's a carefree spirit who constantly reminds us of her existence with upbeat singing, while every other character is doing all of the serious stuff. This probably added to my initial dislike of her character, since she never seemed to take her job as a pilot seriously. Being fashionably late in her role as support Eva, and even at the start of 3.0, ducking out early, leaving Asuka and an unconscious Shinji in Unit 1 to deal with a surprise Eva attack. I honestly thought that after waiting all of that time to watch 3.0, that when we got to the legitimate new material so far removed from the original timeline of the series, that we would finally be able to see what the plan for her character was, to learn what her deal is. But we never do. Not really, anyways. Evangelion has always had a level of unexplained circumstance that has led to rampant fan theory and interpretations over the years, and I feel that Mari's inclusion narratively is just another mystery box for people to mull over for the next few decades, or however long the series lasts in the cultural zeitgeist. Oh, her last name is Iscariot? What the hell does that mean? Do I really need to sit here and explain the franchise's history with biblical subtext of which she is now included in? Heck, is that even her name? It could just be a nickname from the time back when she apparently worked with Fuyutsuki, Gendo, and Yui. Because yeah, That's a thing. Maybe she betrayed all of them in an Iscariot fashion, and she gets called out as such. Or maybe it's another needless biblical addition that means little and just makes her sound far deeper and cooler than she actually is. I doubt we'll ever know, because even if you were to ask Anno about it, he probably wouldn't give a straight answer. This is assuming he even has one to give in the first place. What we do know from Anno about Mari, if we know anything about her, is that, again, from the beginning, she was designed to destroy Evangelion. However you want to interpret those words of his. And, well, I can't say that it's an inapt description of her character, at the very least. Her purpose is to show the audience, to show the people watching that you can't always get what you want. Mari is not what you want her to be. She's what Anno wants her to be. Mari is there to destroy your preconceptions of Evangelion, to take whatever you thought you wanted from an ending to this story and toss it out the window while singing the entire time. At the end of this film, we see Shinji on a train platform, seemingly a much more adjusted human being than he was before, and he ends up talking to Mari, and they run off into the sunset together. Narratively, this annoys me for reasons I've mentioned. These characters have such little interaction that the reasoning behind Mari's actions make little sense in the context of the story. But maybe that's the point. Largely, I feel like this entire film franchise is either a giant middle finger to the rabid fans of the franchise from Anno himself, or perhaps more charitably, a small attempt by him to teach us lessons about the universe that he has slowly come to understand from his time on this planet. People were disappointed by both previous endings to this franchise, from its underbaked finale in the series to its somewhat thought-provoking conclusion in the original film. Some people wanted a kind of closure with this story and these characters that they never got out of what came before, and perhaps Anno wanted some closure as well. It just was a closure that took him 14 years to develop. Which, by the way, 2007 is when this all started. 14 years it took for this film series to wrap up, and if you don't really have any context for that, let me put it another way. It was 14 years between the release of 1.0 and 4.0, but only 11 years from the end of the original series to 1.0. Oh yeah, I'm not even including End of Evangelion here, which if we did, that came out in 1997, and then there was an only 10-year gap here. For a bit of time there, I was expecting Anno to come out and be like, yeah, 4.0 isn't going the way I had hoped. You know, we're just gonna start everything from scratch and reanimate 1.0 again, because it has been 14 years. Thankfully, he didn't do that, but I would have rolled with it if he had. I think a lot of us would. Like, he has talked about how he's done with Evangelion after this, and a part of me does believe him. A part of me thinks he'll keep to that and never work on another Evangelion again. Possibly he won't even direct or animate anything again. He probably has enough money to retire, but then again, considering how much of an influence on his work life the great Hayao Miyazaki has been, and the amount of times that man has retired, anything is game. The final verdict. The rebuild of Evangelion is not an enjoyable series of films. It's not a narrative that tries to tell an interesting story for the sake of it, or follows normal conventions for the tropes that it covers. If it was, this heavy, action-oriented franchise would be about the protagonists fighting evils and prevailing with the power of their heart, or the bonds that they make with their fellow pilots, or any such way that most of the super robot shows from Anno's youth would have wrapped things up in a bow. But Eva is none of that. The original series to Evangelion was quite depressing for a lot of reasons. There was an undeniable feeling of despair that resonated from the work that I think most people were, or at least some people were, turned off by. People wanted to see Shinji overcome his damage, see Asuka prevail against her demons, see Rei find meaning in her life, see them all come together to give themselves a happy ending. Or, at the very least, stop the world's destruction, but it never did any of that. The world was destroyed, the characters were shattered into atoms of orange goo, and the only remnants are two characters on a beach at the end of the world. I feel Rebuild of Evangelion is supposed to be like a beacon of hope. I don't feel like the ending we were presented here is what we wanted. Perhaps maybe it's just the ending we deserved. One that has us realize that We need to overcome what life has given us because, well, life is not kind. But we need to live on anyway. Back in 2009, I started talking about anime with the belief that the ending is paramount. How a story chooses to end affects how we will look at the work as a whole. And I may not be happy with this ending to Evangelion. I may have wanted something different. But now that I have seen this, now that I have experienced this, I don't think that these films could have ended in a way that I legitimately enjoyed. And perhaps I just need to deal with that. If you watched Neon Genesis Evangelion, you do need to watch this film series. You need to experience this alternate take on this world and these characters. You need to see what it is these films can teach you. Like, you might not enjoy it, but that's not what these films are about. Hard-learned lessons aren't always enjoyable, but I still feel like these films can teach us things worth learning about ourselves. Breaking apart the world is a trivial matter. However, rebuilding it is not so easy. Thanks for watching. Cut to several months later. I have been working on this video on and off since November? Probably doesn't seem like it, especially because as I've been looking at the edit as it currently stands, it doesn't seem all that complicated. It's a longer video, yes, and I normally don't do that. However, there's a lot of weird emotional feelings that exist within this video. Evangelion has always been very personal to me. It's kind of been one of those shows that has been there since the beginning, and I wanted to try and explain that and showcase that and its effect on my life since I've been doing anything anime related. And because of that, there are so many times where even after recording, I would sit there and I would stare at the edit screen and just kind of freeze and not do anything because I didn't want to, part of me didn't want to work on it, which is why it's been in the works since last November. I've actually filmed it twice. So like the vast majority of me on camera that you've been looking at in this video wasn't from the November cut, I don't believe. It was from, I think, a version I recorded at the start of January. So still pretty long, but my God. But now it's over, mostly. I still need to tidy up the edit between as I am sitting here now doing this outro and when you guys are watching it. But for the most part, the vast majority of the work is done. Part of that, though, is because I was able to get some editing help from a good friend, Nies, who took my extremely rough cut of just me and fancied it up a little bit. So all of the cool edits that existed throughout the video, that was him, because I couldn't drag myself to actually properly edit the video. And I've spent a good long time trying to figure out why that was. I don't know if it was just some weird combination of burnout of video making, or far more likely it had to do with the subject matter, because, I don't know, a part of me doesn't want Evangelion to end, sort of. See, I'm the kind of person that does really weird things in my head because I don't want certain things to end. So people who know me also know that there are, like, what's a good example? There are Ghibli films I haven't watched because I don't want to live in the world where I don't have a Ghibli film available to me, even if that might mean that I might never watch a particular Ghibli film for that exact reason. It's weird, but it's like, I've always had a Ghibli film available to me since basically I've ever started caring about anime, so it would be really weird and it would just feel off to not have that be a thing. Conversely, I feel like for a very long time there has always been the hope of more Evangelion. I mentioned in the video that, yeah, I was in high school when the rebuild started, so there was like a brief period of time, maybe when I very first started watching anime, between when End of Evangelion, when I had watched the original series and End of Eva, to when the rebuild came up, that there was no more Evangelion. But like, I feel like the vast majority of my life there has always been Evangelion available to me to watch. Like, I mean, technically I was born before the show aired, so that those years don't count. But so finishing this video is very much kind of like a closing the book on the series, at least until Kara decides that they want to make more money and they go and make something Evangelion related without Anno, which I hope they don't. And I actually kind of hope that Anno doesn't do anything more Eva after this, because I feel like, especially with how long it's taken him to do these rebuild films, that he might feel more forced to do it rather than anything else. I don't want him to make it because he feels like he has to. I would only want him to make more Ava because he wants to. And for anyone that's watched 4.0, it seems fairly clear that he's done. He's out. He doesn't want to touch it anymore. And you know, since it's been a big part of his life and his creative career for so long, I understand why he wants to be like, yep, I'm done. But that's why I feel like this video's taken so long. It's because I don't want it to end. And as you guys are sitting there watching this, that means it's definitely over. Because there's still a couple of days that I have while sitting here between when I finish the final edit and it gets sent off onto YouTube. So then I guess I'm just gonna have to move on to something else, whatever that may be. And that is sort of exciting, but there is a little bit of melancholy with it, you know? To no longer have that available, to no longer have that as being something in my life is just so weird. And it's a shift, it's a change, and it's something that I need to get used to. So as I sit here and attempt to decide what the hell I'm doing next, now that I live in a world where there's not really any more Evangelion to talk about, I would like to once again thank you all for joining me throughout this book closing, this breakup, as I feel like the video will eventually be titled, because we're done with it. We're moving on. We have ended the relationship, and now we are walking away, and it's fine. Everything is still there, but we're done. We're done. So thank you for sticking out this probably entire hour, however long the final cut of the video is. Thank you very much for watching, and a very special thank you, of course, to all of my patrons who make videos like this possible. I cannot thank you guys enough, especially for videos like this that are far more passion-driven in some way, shape, or form, even if I had to drag myself to somehow get it done. And specifically, I would like to thank patrons Ross Emerson, Omar Showman, Hector Montemayor, Wago221, City Yamako, and Ryfin Bonaparte for being especially awesome. Because seriously, without you guys, I don't think I would be doing a video like this. And while I will probably always have some regrets with this video, because there are going to be certain things that I look back on and like, I really wish I mentioned that, or I brought that up, or I talked about that. It's already an hour-long video. And I have limits. Maybe in the future, I will be able to more easily make hour or multi-hour epic videos that I know some content creators have been able to do, but that is not me yet. And so, until next time, whatever topic that might be, ladies, gentlemen, and others, watch more anime and stay frosty.